It started as just another Thursday night taping of The Tonight Show, until Jimmy Fallon noticed Daniel Radcliffe's hands trembling. Not stage nerves, something deeper, something that would turn a simple interview into the most watched moment in late-night television history. The Tonight Show studio buzzed with its usual electric energy. The Roots filled the air with their signature sound. Audience members waved excitedly at the cameras, and Jimmy sat behind his iconic desk, wearing that million-dollar smile that had made him America's favorite late-night host. Across from him, Daniel Radcliffe looked relaxed in a navy blazer, promoting his latest Broadway show. Everything was going perfectly. They'd been chatting for about 10 minutes. The usual banter about Daniel's recent projects. A few laughs about his Harry Potter days. Some playful teasing about his height. The audience was eating it up. Jimmy was in his element, that natural charm flowing effortlessly as he guided the conversation with practiced ease. But then something shifted. During a commercial break, as makeup artists rushed to touch up their faces and producers whispered last-minute notes, Jimmy noticed Daniel reaching into his jacket pocket. Not for his phone, not for notes. For something small, something he seemed reluctant to touch. A folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, yellowed with age. "What's that?" Jimmy asked casually, his curiosity genuine but gentle. Daniel looked down at the paper in his palm, his expression changing. The confident actor who had just been making the audience laugh suddenly looked vulnerable, almost childlike. It's stupid, really." "Nothing stupid here," Jimmy said, and something in his tone made the crew members nearby pause their bustling. There was a shift in the atmosphere, subtle but unmistakable. When they came back from commercial, Jimmy tried to return to the scripted questions, but he couldn't shake what he'd seen. Daniel was holding that paper throughout the segment, occasionally glancing down at it with an expression Jimmy recognized from his own mirror during difficult times. Pain, longing, the kind of hurt that doesn't heal completely, just learns to hide better. Halfway through discussing Daniel's Broadway performance, Jimmy made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He abandoned his cards, leaned forward, and spoke directly to Daniel as if the cameras weren't rolling, as if millions weren't watching. "Daniel," Jimmy said softly, "that paper. What is it?" The studio fell silent. Not the controlled quiet of a commercial break, but the organic silence that happens when something real intrudes on something performed. Daniel looked up, startled. He'd been lost in whatever memory that piece of paper held. Daniel started, then stopped. He looked at the audience, at the cameras, at Jimmy. "It's just something I've carried with me for years." Jimmy stood up from behind his desk. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't part of the show format. But something in Daniel's voice told him that whatever was happening here was more important than entertainment. "Can you share it?" Jimmy asked, walking around to sit in the chair next to Daniel. "Only if you want to." Daniel stared at the paper for a long moment. The studio audience, sensing something profound was unfolding, watched in complete silence. Even the Roots had stopped their ambient play. It was just two men, one holding a piece of the past, the other offering a safe space for whatever needed to be said. "I wrote this to myself when I was 11, Daniel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Right before I got cast in Harry Potter. Before everything changed." Jimmy nodded, not pushing, just present. Daniel unfolded the paper carefully, as if it might disintegrate. His hands were shaking slightly. I was so lonely then. I didn't have friends at school. The other kids thought I was weird, because I liked reading more than football. I spent most lunches hiding in the library. The audience was completely still. This wasn't the polished celebrity interview they'd expected. This was something raw, something real. "What does it say?" Jimmy asked gently. Daniel looked at the paper, then at Jimmy. "Dear future me," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I hope you're happy. I hope you found friends. I hope you don't feel invisible anymore. I hope grown-ups listen to you, and I hope you remember that even when no one sees you, you're still important. Love, Daniel. Age. The words hung in the air like a prayer. Jimmy felt something break open in his chest. Around them, the studio had become a sacred space where pretense couldn't survive. Daniel, Jimmy said, and his voice was different now. Not the practiced smoothness of a talk show host, but the genuine warmth of a friend. That little boy who wrote that letter, he wasn't invisible. He was just waiting for the right people to see him. Daniel's composure cracked completely. 25 years of carrying that loneliness, of remembering what it felt like to eat lunch alone, to walk home wondering if anyone would notice if he simply disappeared. All of it came pouring out. Jimmy did something then that no talk show host had ever done on live television. He stood up, walked over to Daniel, and without a word, wrapped him in a hug. Not a quick, camera-friendly embrace, but a real hug. The kind that says, I see you, I understand, you're not alone. The audience began to react, but not with applause, with soft sounds of recognition, of shared pain, of collective understanding. People were crying, not just Daniel, not just Jimmy, but audience members who remembered their own childhood loneliness, their own desperate letters to future selves, their own invisible years. When Jimmy finally pulled back, he kept his hands on Daniel's shoulders. That 11-year-old boy, he said, looking directly into Daniel's eyes. He did everything right, he survived. He grew up to bring joy to millions of children around the world. He became the friend to other lonely kids that he wished he'd had. Daniel wiped his eyes, still holding that worn piece of paper. I read it sometimes when I'm having a bad day. To remember what? That I made it through before. That the loneliness isn't forever. Jimmy turned to face the audience, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. I want everyone here to understand something, he said. The person sitting next to you, the person you work with, the kid who sits alone at lunch, they might be carrying their own letter, their own loneliness, and sometimes, all they need is for someone to see them. He turned back to Daniel. Thank you for letting us see that letter. Thank you for letting us see you. The applause that followed wasn't entertainment, applause. It was something deeper. Recognition, gratitude, the sound of people connecting with something true. But Jimmy wasn't finished. He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. Right there in front of millions of viewers, he sat down and began to write. Dear 11-year-old Daniel, he said as he wrote, this is from everyone who's watching tonight. We see you. We've always seen you. You were never invisible. You were just waiting for your moment to shine. And when that moment came, you didn't just shine for yourself. You lit up the world for everyone who ever felt the way you felt. Love. Everyone who needed to hear your story tonight. He folded the paper and handed it to Daniel. Now you have 2 letters, he said. When the show finally ended, when the cameras stopped rolling and the audience filed out, something had changed. Not just for Daniel, not just for Jimmy, but for everyone who witnessed that moment. It became the most shared clip in Tonight Show history, not because it was funny, but because it was true. The letters, both Daniel's original and Jimmy's response, were eventually framed and donated to a children's literacy foundation. But their real impact lived in the thousands of messages from viewers sharing their own stories of childhood loneliness, their own letters to future selves, their own moments of feeling invisible. That night proved something that gets lost in our polished, filtered world. The most powerful moments happen not when we perform perfectly, but when we show up authentically, when we choose connection over content, truth over entertainment, and vulnerability over armor. Jimmy Fallon learned something that changed how he approached every interview afterward. Sometimes the best questions aren't the ones you prepare. Sometimes they're the ones that come from simply paying attention to what someone needs to share. And Daniel Radcliffe. He still carries that letter. But now it's not just a reminder of who he was. It's a reminder of who he became. and how many other invisible children he helped feel seen along the way. Because that's what happens when someone finally listens. That's what happens when loneliness meets compassion. That's what happens when a childhood letter finds its way into the light. But the story doesn't end there. What happened after the cameras stopped rolling revealed even more about the power of that moment. As the studio crew began their cleanup, Daniel remained in his chair, still holding both letters. Jimmy, instead of rushing off to his dressing room as he usually did, sat back down beside him. The audience had left, but the energy of what they'd shared still filled the space. "I've never done anything like that before," Jimmy admitted quietly. "Stopped everything like that. But when you read that letter," he paused, searching for words. "It felt like that 11-year-old was still sitting right there with us." Daniel nodded, carefully refolding his childhood letter. "He was. He always is. Every interview, every performance, every time someone recognizes me on the street, he's there wondering if this is real, if I'm still that invisible kid pretending to be someone worth seeing." Jimmy's production assistant approached hesitantly, clipboard in hand. "Jimmy, we need to prep for tomorrow's rehearsal. Give us a minute," Jimmy said gently, never taking his eyes off Daniel. That minute turned into an hour. Two men, sitting in an empty television studio, sharing stories they'd never told before. Jimmy talked about his own childhood, about feeling like he had to be funny to be loved, about the loneliness of being the entertainer even when all he wanted was to be seen as just Jimmy. Daniel spoke about the weight of fame that came so young, about losing his anonymity before he'd figured out who he was beneath it. "You know what's strange?" Daniel said as they finally prepared to leave. "I wrote that letter because I thought no one would ever really see me. But sitting here tonight, reading it out loud, I realized something. That little boy who felt invisible, he was actually the most honest version of me I've ever been." 3 months later, The Tonight Show received a package addressed to Jimmy Fallon. Inside was a collection of over 2,000 letters, handwritten notes from children and adults around the world who had watched the Daniel Radcliffe episode. Letters to their younger selves, letters to their future selves, letters to anyone who had ever felt invisible. One letter stood out among the rest. It was from a 10-year-old girl named Sophie, from Manchester, England. "Dear Mr. Fallon and Mr. Daniel, I saw your show on YouTube because my mom showed me. I have a letter too that I wrote to myself. It says I hope I make friends, and that I hope people stop calling me weird. After watching you, I showed my letter to my teacher. She cried and hugged me, just like you hugged Mr. Daniel. Now she reads me stories at lunch, and other kids want to listen too. I'm not invisible anymore. Thank you for showing me. It's okay to feel lonely sometimes. Love, Sophie, age 10. Jimmy read that letter on air the following week, his voice thick with emotion. "This is what happens," he told his audience, holding up Sophie's carefully written note. "When we stop pretending everything is perfect and start sharing what's real." The producers decided to create a recurring segment called Letters to Yourself, where guests could share meaningful correspondence they'd written to their past or future selves. It became one of the most beloved features of the show, generating millions of views and inspiring schools across the country to implement similar programs. Daniel guest hosted the segment twice, each time bringing new letters from fans who had found the courage to share their own stories. The original childhood letter he'd read that night was eventually displayed in the Writers' Museum in Edinburgh, alongside a placard that read, "Sometimes the most powerful words are the ones we write to ourselves." But perhaps the most profound change was in Jimmy himself. He began ending each show differently, looking directly into the camera and speaking not to the millions watching, but to the one person who might need to hear it most. If you're out there tonight feeling invisible, if you're carrying your own letter, your own loneliness, your own secret hope, I want you to know something. You're not alone. You're not invisible. And your story matters. Tomorrow might be the day someone sees you exactly as you are and loves you for it. That became his signature sign-off, repeated nightly for years afterward. Viewers began calling it Jimmy's promise, and it became as iconic as his monologue or musical performances. Daniel returned to The Tonight Show exactly 1 year later. When Jimmy asked if he still carried the letter, Daniel smiled and pulled out a well-worn wallet. Inside, carefully protected by plastic, were both letters, the one from his 11-year-old self, and Jimmy's response from that unforgettable night. "I read them both sometimes," Daniel said. "When I'm having a difficult day, or when I meet a young fan who reminds me of who I used to be, they remind me that loneliness isn't permanent. That being seen by one person can change everything. That the words we speak to each other matter more than we know." The audience applauded, but it was different from that night a year ago. This time it was the applause of celebration, of recognition, of a promise kept, and a story that had grown beyond their wildest expectations. As the show ended that night, Jimmy walked Daniel to his dressing room. "Thank you," Jimmy said, "for trusting me with that letter, for trusting us with that moment." "Thank you," Daniel replied, "for showing me that the scared 11-year-old who wrote it wasn't someone to hide from. He was someone to honor." That exchange became the final piece of a story that proved something powerful. Authenticity doesn't diminish with time. Real moments don't fade. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is show the world the letter you wrote to yourself when you thought no one would ever really see you. Because when that moment comes, when vulnerability meets compassion under bright lights, and before rolling cameras, magic happens. Not the manufactured magic of television, but the real magic of human connection. The magic that turns loneliness into hope, and where being seen becomes an act of love that echoes far beyond any studio.